The BFG by Roald Dahl. Chapter 22. Capture. The BFG had made thousands of journeys to and from giant country over the years, but he'd never, in his life, made one quite like this, with 9 huge helicopters roaring along just overhead. He'd never before travelled in broad daylight either. He hadn't dared to. But this was different. Now he was doing it for the Queen of England herself, and he was frightened of nobody. As he galloped across the British Isles with the helicopters thundering above him, people stood and gaped and wondered what on earth was going on. They had never seen the likes of it before, and they never would again. Every now and again, the pilots of the helicopters would catch a glimpse of the small girl wearing glasses, crouching in the giant's right ear and waving to them. They always waved back. The pilots marvelled at the giant's speed and the way he leapt across wide rivers and over huge houses. But they hadn't seen anything yet. "Oh, be careful to hang on tight. We's going fast as a fizzle crump." The BFG changed into his famous top gear, and all at once he began to fly forward as though there were springs in his legs and rockets in his toes. He went skimming over the earth like some magical hop, skip and jumper, with his feet hardly ever touching the ground. As usual, Sophie had to crouch low in the crevice of his ear to save herself from being swept clean away. The 9 pilots in their helicopters suddenly realised that they were being left behind. The giant was streaking ahead. They opened their throttles to full speed, and even then they were only just able to keep up. In the leading machine, the head of the Air Force was sitting beside the pilot. He had a world atlas on his knees, and he kept staring first at the atlas, then at the ground below, trying to figure out where they were going. Frantically, he turned the pages of the atlas. "Where the devil are we going?" he cried. "I haven't the foggiest idea," the pilot answered. "The Queen's orders were to follow the giant, and that's exactly what I'm doing." The pilot was a young Air Force officer with a bushy moustache. He was very proud of his moustache. He was also quite fearless, and he loved adventure. He thought this was a super adventure. "Ha! It's fun going to new places," he said. "New places?" shouted the head of the Air Force. "What the blazes do you mean, new places?" "Well, this place we're flying over now isn't in the atlas, is it?" the pilot said, grinning. And there they are, head of the Air Force, and the pilot, who liked adventure, with his bushy moustache. "You're darn right it isn't in the atlas," cried the head of the Air Force. "We've flown clean off the last page." "I expect that old giant knows where he's going," the young pilot said. "He's leading us to disaster," cried the head of the Air Force. He was shaking with fear. In the seat behind him sat the head of the army, who was even more terrified. "You don't mean to tell me we've gone right out of the atlas?" he cried, leaning forward to look. "That's exactly what I'm telling you. Look for yourself. Here's the very last map in the whole flaming atlas. We went off that over an hour ago." He turned the page. As in all atlases, there were 2 completely blank pages at the very end. "So now we must be somewhere here," he said, putting a finger on one of the blank pages. "Where's here?" cried the head of the army. The young pilot was still grinning broadly. He said to them, "That's why they always put 2 blank pages at the back of the atlas. They're for new countries. You're meant to fill them in for yourself." The head of the Air Force glanced down at the ground below. "Just look at this godforsaken desert. All the trees are dead and all the rocks are blue." "Oh, the giant has stopped us. He's waving us down," the young pilot said. The pilots throttled back the engines, and all 9 helicopters landed safely on the ground. On the great yellow wasteland. Then each of them lowered a ramp from its belly. 9 jeeps, one from each helicopter, were driven down the ramps. Each jeep contained 6 soldiers and a vast quantity of thick rope and heavy chains. "I don't see any giants," the head of the army said. "Oh, the giants is all just out of sight over there. But if you's taking those slosh-bunkling, noisy belly ploppers any closer, all the giants is waking up at once, and then pop goes the weasel." "So you want us to proceed by jeep?" "Oh yes, but you must all be very, very hushy quiet. No roaring of motors, no shouting, no mucking about, no piggery jokery. The BFG, with Sophie still in his ear, trotted forward, and the jeeps followed close behind. Suddenly, the most dreadful rumbling noise was heard by everyone. The head of the army went pea-green in the face. Those are guns! There's a battle raging somewhere up ahead of us. Turn back, the lot of you, let's get out of here. Oh, pig swiffle, those noises is not guns. Of course they're guns. I'm a military man and I know a gun when I hear one. Turn back. Oh, those is just the giants, snarling in their sleep. I's a giant myself and I know a giant snorter when I's hearing one. Are you quite sure? All positive. Proceed cautiously. They all moved on. Then they saw them. Even at a distance, they were enough to scare the daylights out of the soldiers. But when they got close and saw what the giants really looked like, they began to sweat with fear. And here they are. Psst. 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 Pretty disgusting. 9 fearsome, ugly, half-naked, 50-foot-long brutes lay sprawled over the ground in various grotesque attitudes of sleep, and the sound of their snoring was indeed like gunfire in a battle. The BFG raised a hand. All the jeeps stopped. The soldiers got out. "What happens if one of them wakes up?" whispered the head of the army, his knees knocking together from fear. "Oh, if any one of them's waking up, he'll gobble you down before you can say knack jive." The BFG answered, grinning hugely. "Me is the only one that won't be gobbled up, because giants is never eating giants. Oh, me and Sophie is the only safe ones, because I's hiding her if that happens." The head of the army took several paces to the rear. So did the head of the Air Force. They climbed rather quickly back into their jeep, ready to make a fast getaway if necessary. "Go forward, men. Go forward and do your duty bravely." The soldiers crept forward with their ropes and chains. All of them were trembling mightily. None dared speak a word. The BFG, with Sophie now sitting on the palm of his hand, stood nearby watching the operation. To give the soldiers their due, they were extremely courageous. There were 6 well-trained, efficient men working on each giant, and within 10 minutes, 8 out of the 9 giants had been trussed up like chickens and were snoring contentedly. The 9th, who happened to be the flesh lump eater, was causing trouble for the soldiers because he was lying with his right arm tucked underneath his huge, enormous body. It was impossible to tie his wrists and arms together without first getting that arm out from underneath him. Very, very cautiously, the 6 soldiers who were working on the flesh lump eater began to pull at the huge arm, trying to release it. The flesh lump eater opened his tiny piggy black eyes. "Which of you foul pesters is wiggling my arm? Is that you, rotsome manhugger?" Suddenly, he saw the soldiers. In a flash, he was sitting up. He looked around. He saw more soldiers. With a roar, he leapt to his feet. The soldiers, petrified with fear, froze where they were. They had no weapons with them. The head of the army put his jeep into reverse. "Human beings! What is all you flush-bunking, rotsome, half-baked beans doing in our country?" He made a grab at a soldier and swept him up in his hand. "I is having early suppers today," he shouted, holding the poor, squirming soldier at arm's length and roaring with laughter. Sophie, standing on the palm of the BFG's hand, was watching, horror-struck. "Do something, quick, before he eats him." "Put that human being down," the BFG shouted. The flesh lump eater turned and stared at the BFG. "What is you doing here with all these grotty twiglets? You is making me very suspicious." The BFG made a rush at the flesh lump eater, but the colossal 54-foot-high giant simply knocked him over with a flick of his free arm. At the same time, Sophie fell off the BFG's palm onto the ground. Her mind was racing. She must do something. She must. She must. She remembered the sapphire brooch the Queen had pinned to her chest. Quickly, she undid it. "I's guzzling you, nice and slow," the Flesh Lumpy was saying to the soldier in his hand. "Then I's guzzling 10 or 20 more of you midgy little maggots down there. You's not getting away from me because I's galloping 50 times faster than you." Sophie ran up behind the Flesh Lump-Eater. She was holding the brooch between her fingers. When she was right up close to the great, naked, hairy legs, she rammed the 3-inch long pin of the brooch as hard as she could into the Flesh Lump-Eater's right ankle. Stab! It went deep into the flesh and stayed there. And there she is, courageous, brave Sophie. Roar! The giant gave a roar of pain and jumped high in the air. He dropped the soldier and made a grab for his ankle. And here is Flesh Lump-Eater and everybody else. Just see how big he is compared to our very own BFG. Not a pleasant way to go. The BFG, knowing what a coward the Flesh Lump-Eater was, saw his chance. "Oh, you was bitten by a snake! I seed it! I seed it biting you! It was a frightsome poison-house viper! It was a dreadly dungerous Vunscreen viper!" "Save our souls!" bellowed the Flesh Lump-Eater. "Sound the crumpets! I is bitten by a Septicus venomous Vunscreen viper!" He flopped to the ground and sat there, howling his head off and clutching his ankle with both hands. His fingers felt the brooch. The teeth of the dreadly viper are still sticking in me. I was feeling the teeth sticking into my anklet." The BFG saw his second chance. "Oh, we must be getting the viper's teeth out at once. Otherwise you is deader than duck soup. I is helping you." The BFG knelt down beside the Flesh Lump-Eater. "Oh, you must grab your anklet very tight with both hands," he ordered. "This will stop the poison-house juices from the venomsome viper going up your leg and into your heart." The Flesh Lump-Eater grabbed his ankle with both hands. "Now close your eyes and grit your teeth and look up to heaven and say your prayers while I's taking out the teeth of the venomsome viper," the BFG said. The terrified Flesh Lump-Eater did exactly as he was told. The BFG signalled for some rope. A soldier rushed it over to him. With both the Flesh Lump-Eater's hands gripping his ankle, it was a simple matter for the BFG to tie the ankles and hands together with a tight knot. Working really fast. "I is pulling out the frightsome viper's teeth," the BFG said as he pulled the knot tight. "Do it quickly, before I is pizened to death." "Ooh, there we is," said the BFG, standing up. "You can look now." When the Flesh Lump-Eater saw that he was trussed up like a turkey, he gave a yell so loud that the heavens trembled. "Rah! Rah!" He rolled and he wriggled, he fought and he figgled, he squirmed and he squiggled, but there was not a thing that he could do. "Oh, well done you," Sophie cried. "Oh, well done you," said the BFG, smiling down at the little girl. "Oh, you saving all our lives." "Will you please get that brooch back for me?" Sophie said. "It belongs to the Queen." The BFG pulled the beautiful brooch out of the Flesh Lump-Eater's ankle. "Ah!" The Flesh Lump-Eater howled. The BFG wiped the pin and handed it back to Sophie. Curiously, not one of the other 8 snoring giants had woken up during the schmozzle. "When you's only sleeping 1 or 2 hours a day, you is sleeping extra, doubly deep," the BFG explained. The head of the army and the Air Force drove forward once again in their jeep. "Her Majesty will be very pleased with me," the head of the army said. "I shall probably get a medal. What's the next move?" Oh, now you's all driving over to my cave to load up my bottles of dreams. We can't waste time with that rubbish. It was the Queen's order, Sophie said. She was now back in the BFG's hand. So the 9 jeeps drove across to the BFG's cave and the great dream loading operation began. There were 50,000 jars in all to be loaded up, more than 5,000 to each jeep, and it took over an hour to finish the job. When the soldiers were loading the dreams, the BFG and Sophie disappeared over the mountains on a mysterious errand. When they came back, the BFG had a sack the size of a small house slung over his shoulder. What's that you've got in there? The head of the army demanded to know. Oh, curiosity is killing the rat, the BFG said, and he turned away from the silly man. When he was sure that all his precious dreams had been safely loaded onto the jeeps, the BFG said, "Oh, now he's driving back to the belly poppers and picking up the frightsome giants." The jeeps drove back to the helicopters. The 50,000 dreams were carried carefully, jar by jar, onto the helicopters. The soldiers climbed back on board, but the BFG and Sophie stayed on the ground. Then they all returned to where the 9 giants were laying. It was a fine sight to see them, these great air machines hovering over the trussed-up giants. It was an even finer sight to see the giants being woken up by the terrific thundering of the engines overhead. And the finest sight of all was to observe those 9 hideous brutes squirming and twisting about on the ground like a mass of mighty snakes as they tried to free themselves from their ropes and chains. Imagine seeing that. "I is flush bunkled," roared the flesh lumpeter. "I is spits wiggled," yelled the child chewer. "I is swog swalloped," bellowed the bone cruncher. "I is goose groggled," howled the man hugger. "I's gun swept," shouted the meat dripper. "I is flog gunkled," screamed the maid masher. "I is slop goggled," squawked the gizzard gulper. "I is scrod squinkled," yowled the blood bottler. "I is pop muggered," screeched the butcher boy. The 9 giant carrying helicopters each chose a separate giant and hovered directly over them. Very strong steel horses with hooks on the ends of them were lowered from the front and rear of each helicopter. The BFG quickly secured the hooks of the giants. Chains, one hook near the legs and the other near the arms. Then very slowly the giants were winched up into the air, parallel with the ground. The giants roared and bellowed, but there was nothing that they could do. The BFG, with Sophie once more resting comfortably in his ear, set off at a gallop for England. The helicopters all banked around and followed after him. It was an amazing spectacle, those 9 helicopters winging through the sky, each with a trussed-up 50-foot-long giant slung underneath it. The giants themselves must have found it an interesting experience. They never stopped bellowing, but their howls were drowned by the noise of the engines. When it began to get dark, the helicopters switched on powerful searchlights and trained them onto the galloping giants so as to keep them in sight. They flew right through the night and arrived in England just as dawn was breaking.